Hello, I'm Norm Grant. I'm the Executive Chairman of the Seafood Importers Association of Australia. You might recall that we had a meeting here in the office of Mr.Thư in Sydney a few months ago with the people from Cantu, and we had a good seminar, and so I would like to give you some information relating to that seminar that you can use back in Vietnam. In Australia, we don't eat as much seafood as people in Asia, but we're about average with the Western countries of the world. I don't know exactly how many kilos that is, but it's not very high. And the reason it's not very high is that we don't have much seafood. So we have to import about 75% of all the seafood that we use. Now, that doesn't mean that Australians don't like their seafood. They love seafood. They understand that it's healthy food, and Australians like healthy food, but we still don't eat enough. In fact, we eat 40% less than recommended by our own health authority. So if this was corrected, the market in Australia could use at least another 1 million tonnes per year. But to achieve that, we will have to do some work and create some more demand. So, about our seafood consumption habits, about 50% of all the seafood in Australia is sold through retail shops or supermarkets, and about 50% is sold through food service outlets like restaurants and cafes. So that means ready to eat or ready to cook, for the chef to cook, seafood. And most of that is value added. So it's made into some other products like crumbed seafood, or some dim sum products, or a range of other products. Now, normally Australians prefer saltwater fish because this country is surrounded by ocean. Australians are not very familiar with freshwater fish because we don't have big rivers like you have in Vietnam. Baza, on the other hand, is very popular, but only because it's really cheap, really cheap. The problem there is it's very difficult to make money from that. One of the reasons baza is so cheap is because there's over-competition, there's too much supply. Now, to gain market share, a lot of Vietnamese suppliers and a lot of Australian importers specify underweight product. That is, they say there's a kilo in a pack, 1 kilo, but actually there's only 850 grams, or 85%. And they achieve that by using water retention chemicals. In our industry, we all know this is the case. The problem with that is that it robs the customer, it destroys the quality of the fish, it makes the fish unsuitable for a lot of products like coating, etc. And it destroys the reputation both of the species and of brand Vietnam. So unfortunately, baza is a case study in what not to do if you're going to market fish in Australia. One thing I didn't tell you about is that the number one species in Australia is still prawns. Australians like prawns more than any other species. So prawns are number one, Tasmanian salmon is number two, barramundi number three, and baza number four. It's the ranking in Australia. But I think it is possible for Vietnam to do a really good job marketing seafood in Australia. And I think, for instance, Kamau is taking the lead there because I know they're having success with their organic prawns. So I think that is a bit of a case study in how to market into Australia. So here are my suggestions about how to go about marketing seafood in Australia. The first thing is you need a theme. Now, Kamau has adopted the organic theme for its farmed prawns, for extensively farmed prawns. So I think that's a great idea. You also need what we call a backstory, that is the story behind your product. Consumers in Australia want to understand where their food comes from, they want to know about the people who grow it, the environment, etc., etc. So the backstory could be, for instance, about a small cottage industry, or it could be about the new taste sensation, or it could be about how this industry is helping poor farmers. Whatever the backstory is, that's great, document it, and we can use that for marketing. The next thing is to find some trusted partners, that is importers, that will help you distribute the products in Australia and do some marketing. Now, my suggestion is that you don't engage with too many, perhaps only one supplier and one importer to start with. If you have too many arrangements with too many importers and distributors in Australia, they will start to compete with each other, and it will start to cause some complications, and it may become counterproductive. So I should just start off small with one or two companies that can work together, and then progress after that. So the next thing is to work out where you want to position your products. Now, if you're planning to export to Australia a commodity product that's already here, then I guess the benchmarks have already been set. But if these are new products, then my suggestion is that you always start at the top end of the market. So you start with low volume, high price, premium product, really good quality, and start small and establish a reputation. If it's a new species, then you need to create a species brand. That's not like a company brand, that is getting people to understand a certain fish, like Atlantic salmon or Pangasius, for instance. And people get to understand about that species, and they know about that species brand, they get familiar with it. And then to establish the company brands as the different suppliers from Vietnam move into this market. So what you should aim to do is to try and find a position for those products with very reputable buyers, restaurants, food service outlets, or retail shops, if that's the market you choose, and create a high benchmark reputation for that product. If you don't, if you start at the bottom and start selling cheaply, it's very difficult to break out of that, because that becomes the benchmark. And unfortunately, that's the problem with Basa now. It's very difficult for anyone, even with very good quality Basa, to move upwards, because the benchmark has already been established at a low level. So the idea is to establish the benchmark at a high level, even if it's only on very small sales at first. But concentrate on those outlets that are what we call influencers. So they're the outlets that influence all the other restaurants or shops, etc., in the cities to follow them. Now, one of the things that we're always concerned about is that if you start to open markets in Australia, that other people will come in with their products and try to compete, and then you have this over-competition situation. But if you start at the high end and set that benchmark really high, then it's much more difficult for people to come in with cheaper, inferior products and compete with you, because the outlets already know what the benchmark is, so they can easily determine these products are not so good. If you don't do that first, they have no benchmark, so they've got nothing to compare with. So it's really important that you start at the high end first. So to start the marketing process, the first thing you have to know is if the product, or if the seafood product, the species, is going to be suitable to Australia. Because not all products are suitable for this market. And it's no good wasting a lot of your time if you're better off selling to another market like Europe or the United States. So if you come to Australia and you determine that the product is probably suitable for this market, then you have to have a look at the base that you have back in Vietnam. So firstly, you need to look at the environment. Is there any contamination in that environment that will cause problems later on? Chemicals like antibiotics, pesticides, heavy metals in the environment, or any organic pathogens like cholera, etc. These things are common all over the world, so you need to be clear about what's in the environment, because it will show up in the fish, and that will cause problems when you go to send that to Australia, because we test all the fish as it arrives on the Australian border, and also it upsets the reputation of the fish. So you have to establish if your environment for growing this fish is clear, and if it is, then you need to get some certification about that. And the same thing applies to sustainability, because people in Australia want to know where their fish came from, and they want to understand that it's sustainable. So you need to work that out, and if possible, get those internationally recognised certifications like Marine Stewardship Council or Aquaculture Stewardship Council or Global Aquaculture Alliance or Global GAP. There are a lot of those. And then the third thing that you need to be sure about is labour welfare. that is the welfare of the workers, right through the supply chain, the people who work on the farms, in the factories, etc. And you'll need some certification around that. Now, these are all basic things in our market in Australia. We ask all our suppliers around the world that they have to have these things in order. And we call it a license to operate. It's not a regulated license like a car license. It's what we call a social license. It's what the Australian community expects that all the people sending food here will do. So they expect that to be normal. Now, this might require you to work with environmental NGOs in Vietnam, but in fact, those organisations can be really helpful. And if you can get the problems with the environment sorted out, if you can prove that the fisheries are sustainable, then those NGOs, environmental NGOs, will be happy to promote that for you. So they give more credibility to your product. And we see great partnerships in Vietnam between large companies and large NGOs. And this has been a very successful combination. So if you can do that, I think it's a really good idea. Another thought is that sometimes in some farming activities or fishing activities in Vietnam, you might be supported by international aid. Those organisations can also really help with this social licence and giving advice and helping you to have a good reputation when your product arrives in Australia. The next stage is processing. Now, wonderful thing about Vietnam is that it has fantastic processing facilities. But the first thing you have to establish is what the market wants. So before the factory starts processing your product, you need to have done some market research in Australia to find out about the portion sizes, the packaging preferences in Australia, and many other things that the factory does, so that you produce a product that's immediately suitable for the market. A big mistake people make is that they go to the factory first, produce the products, and when those products come to the market, they're not suitable. So you need to do that research in Australia first, and then make sure all the right things happen back in the factory. So when you've done all that and you have products ready to sell and to send to Australia, then you could commence marketing here. Now, one of the strategies that's been very successful in Australia is what we call regional marketing. So people like to know that the oysters come from Coffin Bay, which is only a little town, or that the salmon comes from Tasmania, which is a state, or some other branding that's not just a company brand, but it indicates where the product comes from. So I think Can Tho has a great story about that region of Vietnam and about that city. And I call it Can Do, because it's a really progressive city and people are doing some amazing things. So I think you can develop a really good regional brand around Can Tho. Doesn't necessarily have to be a Vietnamese national brand, but if you can get support from the Vietnamese national government, that would be really good.